And then
just send it to WAFLT board. Great, thank you.
And good afternoon. So my name is Dr. Veronica Trapani, and welcome to my session, International Students Counseling Expectations and Experiences in Accessing Mental Health Services. That is a mouthful, but this was the research that I conducted to fulfill the requirements of my doctorate capstone. And I thought it could be of interest to those seeking to understand a little bit more about what international students, their perspectives on mental health and some of their experiences both previous and after coming to the United States. So we wanted to first look at a problem of practice, and that is, the emphasis on mental health of the previous decade has not missed the college and university sphere. As more people seek counseling in the general population, so has the demand of availability for therapy on college campuses risen. With more than 1 million international students enrolled in United States colleges and universities during the 2019-2020 school year, so pre-COVID, and most of them paying full tuition, the significance of their existence in American scholastic life cannot be discounted. International students bring not only a diversity of thought and perspective, but also an income source not supported by financial aid. The Institute of International Education's Open Doors report in 2012 stated that a lack of funding to public universities has increased their reliance on the revenue provided by international students. So with the onset of COVID-19 in March of last year, which shut down campuses, and then the long-drawn battle about allowing J-1 visa students to be enrolled at American universities without being on campus, not being solved until August 2020, many colleges saw their enrollment of international students drop. All of this has accumulated for universities around the United States. College student mental health is in crisis, and international students are not immune from it. This capstone project explored the cultural variations in international students' counseling expectations and the reasons for use of or failure to utilize counseling services. So I worked with a university in Michigan, in the Midwest, and we really wanted to look at, can we understand the expectations and experiences of their overlapping international student body? And could we increase the knowledge of mental health opportunities and increase the opportunities for dialogue? And perhaps then we could increase the percentage of international students who use counseling center and mental health services. So first we had to look at what affects international student use of mental health. Is it cultural background? Is it knowledge of mental health treatment? Is it mobility or transportation? We can't discount the fact that if students are not living on campus, how are they able to get back and forth to campus? Goals of this project were to understand student expectations, utilize mental health awareness opportunities, and increase the opportunities for dialogue. So I had 3 guiding questions for my research. The first one was, how do counseling expectations vary according to student nationality? The second was, what barriers exist to international students' use of counseling? And finally, considering social identity theory, what organizational structures and supports can be introduced to support international students' use of mental health services? I do want to give a brief overview of the organizational chart. I gave a pseudonym to the university with which I worked, so we will call it Elmwater University, or EU for short. They are a mid-sized public research university located in the metropolitan region of a major city in the Midwestern United States. They have almost 20,000 undergraduate and graduate students. Next, we looked at, as we branched out, into the Office of Global Engagement. They work to maintain global partnerships and also provide English as a second language supports. On the other side, we do look at the Student Service of Health and Safety, under which came the Counseling Center. So the direct office that I worked with was the International Student and Scholars Office. They serve roughly between 500 and 1,000 international students on a yearly basis from over 60 countries. The services they provide include immigration-related advising, social and cultural counseling, and then any necessary orientation sessions. On the other hand, we have Elmwater University Counseling Center, and they provided a broad range of mental health services, which include personal counseling, consultation and outreach, and crisis intervention counseling. All of this is provided by licensed psychologists and interns and is based on a short-term model. So students get 12 sessions with the practitioners at the university before they are referred out to longer-term and long-term models outside of the university. There were quite a few different stakeholders when looking at the research in this project. So we always want to look at the intersection of influence and power and the interest. The one that had obviously the most power would be the university itself. They determine funding, they determine who gets hired and fired and what programs are kept or abolished. But I also wanted to look at the interests of the Counseling Center and the International Student and Scholars Office. The Counseling Center were actually the ones that came to me and wanted to find out ways that they could reach out to the international student population. The counselors themselves obviously have quite a bit of interest, and then the international students themselves. I thought a really interesting stakeholder also that is not commonly brought up, but the families of international students. The reasons why international students come to this country for whether undergraduate, graduate, or postdoctoral opportunities range and are very varied. And some of that also includes, the families that are paying a lot of money for their student to be educated over here. So obviously they are interested in their student doing as well as possible and being as mentally fit as they can throughout their studies. I also wanted to look at, there are kind of two different approaches to therapy. And, depending on where our students were coming from, it could be a more Western or a more Eastern approach to therapy. So in the Western tradition, and I use Western very loosely, that would be generally, what we're looking at as in the Western Hemisphere and places like the EU, and maybe even in the South Pacific, looking at Australia and New Zealand. You have more focus on psychopathology. What is wrong with the person? It relies on a medical model of alleviating symptoms. So once we've figured out what's going on with you, how do we fix this? There's also a lot more emphasis placed on correction and on mitigating feelings and symptoms. And finally, emotional problems aren't really viewed as affecting the body, although I think that this view is changing over time. But really, we think of it as kind of your body health and then your mental health. Eastern counseling, on the other hand, tends to focus on flourishing and achieving optimum human development through leading an ethical life. And a lot of times we think of Eastern counseling coming from Asia, whether it is the Near East or the Far East, so Southeast Asia, India, China, Korea, Japan, even some areas of Russia and some of the former Soviet Union. And this is obviously rooted in a more integrated mind and body, so overall body health. And finally, Eastern counseling also does focus on utilizing the body's natural healing systems and restorative balances. Some of those commonly used things in Eastern counseling include meditation. It could be yoga. There could be other approaches like that. But I think that, where they overlap is focus on relieving human suffering and helping people feel better, whether it is focusing on alleviating the symptoms or coming to terms with the symptoms. We just want people to be able to live their optimal life. So my whole theory of practice and what I kind of centered my research on was Teichl and Turner's social identity theory, which came out which was originally based on Tajfel's idea that groups to which people belong, such as culture, social class, or religion, are important sources of satisfaction and self-confidence. Groups give us a sense of social identity and a feeling of belonging to the social world. Expectations are created and built upon the group norms. According to Zhao, Jindal-Snape, Topping, and Todman, social identity theory considers how group members affect individual identity and highlights two aspects. One is the role of categorization and social comparison in related to self-esteem. So where do I fit and how well do I fit in where I am? And we couple that with in-group and out-group favoritism and out-group derogation. So, you know, we base who we are on our social groups. And when a person's environment changes, they can lose a lot of their sense of personal identity, and that can affect their social identity. You know, and it does not just have to be physically placing yourself in a different place. It could be anytime crossing of a boundary, I'd say. So going from student to teacher, going from teacher or a working person to being retired, becoming a parent, all of these things change your social identity and where you fall. And they're always, you know, there's going to be an in-group, a we, and a they. My project design and my data collection, based on my research questions, I had 3 different means of collecting data. And so the first was I used I had a 3-part process, which was a quantitative questionnaire, a qualitative interview, and then referencing literature and similar university ideas. So the first was a confidential online email questionnaire sent to all of Elmwater's international students about their expectations of counseling, their knowledge of campus resources for mental health, which included access and availability of care, their personal utilization of the counseling center, and general attitudes and feelings towards mental health. I expected that all of these would differ based on length of time in the United States, their language, their cultural background, what country they came from, and even who they've associated themselves with on campus. I used the expectations about counseling form because it had already produced 3 factors in previous studies, which was a personal commitment. So how involved personally will the student be in what they think they should be, what they think they would expect to do in counseling. Facilitative conditions, what would the environment be like if they go to counseling? And finally, counselor expertise. How do they think that practitioners, whether they are therapists, whether they are psychiatrists, how would they then see themselves in in that counseling session? It's most widely used measure of expectations in counseling research, and I had a personally made demographic survey to be more specific to the needs of the project. Besides factors like gender identity, age and year in school, other aspects of social identity like nationality, languages spoken, and current proximity to campus were considered. Second, I just had a data collection, which were voluntary interviews for which subjects could sign up. All respondents were encouraged to interview whether they had sought counseling services or not. And so from there, I used a therapy expectations form and actually had 2 separate ones. One was a previous, so for those who had already utilized counseling services at a university, it didn't have to be EU, and potential. So for those who had not yet, but were interested or still wanted to participate. Finally, after analyzing the answers from the questionnaire and the interviews, student suggestions and other structures found in the related literature guided the recommendations and the potential professional development that I recommended for the International Students and Scholars Office and the Counseling Center for them to implement. So just a quick on my survey demographics. Unfortunately, this was conducted during COVID, and it was conducted over the summer and the fall of 2020. So we were just starting to experience a lot of Zoom burnout. I was able, though, to get 45 responses out of about 500, so less than 10%, but I got what I could. I thought it was really interesting that I got mainly graduate students, and 60% of them lived within 10 miles of campus. So when we were looking at factors of utilizing services, how close they were really didn't actually have as much impact as we thought. 56% of the responses were from Asia, and a quarter of those were from India, 30% from Europe. And we had 28 different languages spoken. That was self-initiated by survey respondents. And the most common non-English languages were German and Hindi. So how do counseling expectations vary according to student nationality? I did actually for factor one, which was client involvement, which involves expectations like the responsibility and openness that a student has to have or a client has to have when coming to a therapy session. European students had a higher mean on our Likert scale, which was higher than Asian students and the total as a whole. So this could indicate that European students assume to participate and be more accountable for the outcomes of therapy. And honestly, this is really expected because of, as we talked about previously with the Western form of therapy, there is a lot of self-reliance, there's a lot of focus on independence and self-sufficiency in a lot of these cultures as well. So, one of the quotes that I received was, the first thing was I wanted to be honest about everything. It was it. So then they get a perfect idea of whatever happened, and then they'll give me the right direction. Students from North America might expect to do work outside of sessions because of a familiarity with mental health and physical therapy. Students from Asia might expect to defer to their counselor or do more work within the session and be guided by their therapist. This could also link to the findings for factor two, which was counselor experience, which included counselor empathy, directiveness, and skill, and that Asian international students' mean was higher than both the total mean and European students. Overall, all groups had lower expectations about their counselor's expertise. This could be because of their knowledge that health professionals are required to already have degrees in order to be employed and working. Eastern and Western perspectives on therapy tend to have different perspectives on the role of the counselor. So a student quote was, "He turned the tables. He started talking, explaining things, giving details about the illness, suggesting new ideas and new methods to tackle these difficulties." If one looks at the therapist as the leader in the session, then the goal with students from more collectivist societies should be to help lead students to their own conclusions and situate them in the context of harmony within the environment. So again, how do they make peace with what they are dealing with, as opposed to what's wrong with you, here's how you fix it. For factor three, which were the facilitative conditions, that includes the environment around the session. And so hopefully it's not only the practitioner, but also anyone that they come in contact with during their time at the counseling center. They would feel acceptance, tolerance, and nurturance. Asian international students' mean was slightly lower than European students, which was the same as the overall. This might indicate that students expect an environment that is open to them and non-judgmental. As one of my respondents said, "I was surprised that I am not at fault." And they promote, and so they're hoping that this also promotes a healthy place to work on mental health issues and the introduction of counseling therapies and medication. Another student quoted, "Also, I didn't expect to see another doctor to prescribe me the medications, and she turned out to be a very, very lovely person. She helped me a lot." For my research question number two, what barriers exist? We found that the findings tended to fall within two groups. There was a social and cultural stigma from the students having already had from their own home countries and home nationalities, and then also just an unfamiliarity with mental health treatment. So I conducted 6 interviews, 4 female, 2 male, and all were grad students. And a common barrier mentioned by the literature and the participants is a negative social and cultural stigma against seeking therapy. Each interviewee's cultural background affected their knowledge of mental health treatment and whether it impacted their desire for treatment. Families can be a psychological barrier to treatment due to a fear of negative social reproductions and the impact on their reputation. This was reason enough for either not seeking or potentially hiding treatment. One of the students, respondents said, it was a while ago, so they were not aware of it. So I was the kind of person who wouldn't talk about it. You know what I'm going through to anyone else. This was a student that had come from India. And this was apparent more in the respondents from Asian countries, which I actually spoke with. When I say Asian countries, we had a respondent from India. We had one from, I believe, Jordan. And then I also had a respondent from China. However, another student from Africa spoke that their mother was supportive and involved. So she was really big on her daughter getting treatment and helping, and really wanted to be involved in the process, even though she was still in Ghana. So the other major barrier was simply unfamiliarity with mental health treatment. Respondents noticed that they did not remember a session at orientation about the counseling center and didn't know what therapy involved. Most that I interviewed, if they found their way to the counselor, they found it through an internet search. None of their advisors nor their deans had advised them to seek treatment, even though some of the symptoms were apparent before the student even arrived in the United States. One respondent talked highly of his issues with obsessive compulsive disorder, and that he had been dealing with that since he was a small boy. And it really did impact how he conducted his work. And he actually dropped out of one undergraduate American university after he was really struggling. And then now that he had come back to another university, Elmwater here, and had been working with counseling treatment, it was completely night and day for him. The most accepting, a lot of them found that the more accepting atmosphere of mental health in America eventually led them to seek treatment. And I thought this was a really funny quote. Maybe it was because of all the talk shows or, being in America for a while, knowing Americans and saying that it's not a bad thing to go seek help. And then finally, I had my what structures and supports can be introduced to encourage participation. And I think really this is some of the most important part. So this was from I did from the literature. I took different potential supports, and this was on my survey. So these were what the students themselves responded with. And a lot of them, you will see that, assigning incoming students a mentor or partner. And what doesn't say here is that they wanted their partner to also be an international student, but not always. They did want to have someone that could guide them, could be a really good guide and mentor for them. If they are having trouble. There was a reluctance to talk to advisors and deans, even though a lot of, especially our graduate students, they're going to work with their advisor every day, and for many years potentially, and they didn't want to show that weakness. So having a mentor partner assigned when the student first arrived on campus, someone who had been through and understood, was really important to them. We also, this was during COVID, so the idea of providing online or virtual appointments would also help in the issue of if they are not able to get to campus. They also, I thought was a really interesting one, was creating an international student council and finding out what are the needs of the international students. So instead of a top-down approach, which we have the director of ISSO and it comes down, they really wanted to be involved. And finally, they wanted advisors and also deans of schools to encourage students to visit the counseling center. If something is wrong, they are the ones who are going to see them most. And if there is an issue with mood or anything like that, they really did. The students believed that having someone with authority, like an advisor, would have given them the push to go seek help. There were some ideas actually that I thought I found from the literature, which did not ring true for our international students at EU. So two of the ideas were having materials translated into multiple languages and help in connecting with counselors with similar nationalities. And honestly, very few of them wanted translated materials or a counselor with their same background. That was surprising to me. I know even when I have sought treatment that I want to, or a doctor, I prefer working with women, someone that can maybe understand me a little bit better, but that was a very low response. And, a lot of them have said, I learned English, so I could study here. So this is part of my time here. So they wanted to continue using English with their counselor. And nobody mentioned transportation or unfamiliarity with language as a barrier. So, again, this is very specific to a small sample of students at one particular university. This could be different, but I think it would be interesting to see broader and larger studies, and also the repeat of this study, which leads to my recommendations. So I had 4 recommendations for Elmwater, and the first was simply to continue to collect and analyze data. I had a very small sample size, right? Less than 10% of the international student population. And also this was done during COVID. It was a very weird year for everybody. I would love to see more focus on first-year students, because whether they are graduate or what we would consider freshmen, they're the ones that are going to have probably the hardest time with adjustment. We all know that, adjusting and to your culture, to a new culture, can be very difficult. And also, I think that, if they repeat this, you could get some longitudinal information, as well as getting some more demographic options. I did not include any questions about religion or ethnicity on here because I didn't think of it. So, seeing if there are differences between students who are, if they are coming from a more Buddhist background, if they are if they follow Confucianism, Christianity, and even looking at those who study Islam. So I really think that there's a lot more data that could be collected and more information. Second thing was a really focused orientation session with the Elmwater University Counseling Center and the counselors, having them there during orientation. Now, the session during orientation would be dedicated to mental health awareness and expectations. So letting students know this could be something that could affect you. If you are feeling this way, you should seek help. And also where. So this could actually be the time that the students could fill out their expectations of counseling. You could also then go back and compare future years. One class, you could follow them. And so having a nice dedicated time to fill out the survey in person, whether that was physical with pen and paper or, with electronic means, computers, it's really great. I also think that they should have a physical walk showing where the location is. Students are more likely to remember and, build that connection. Number 3 was a peer mentorship program and an international student council. So getting international students more involved with their life on campus. So organizing a diverse group of international students can, really help with our new students, first years or graduate students coming in and creating a new social identity. They will have an automatic in-group that they can join. And so giving them people to surround themselves with who also, again, we talked about, have been through this, who can answer questions and there won't be pressure and there's no authority, I think would be really helpful. And the International Student Council, again, having those needs heard and brought to the officers and the leaders of ISSO, I think are really important. And finally, professional development for advisors, deans of schools, and counselors. So, I know a lot of educators in the K-12 system were being taught how to recognize signs of mental health struggles. And while I'm sure that this has also been something that has been done on college campuses, it might be, our international students might show differently than some of our native or domestic students. So having advisors learn what potentially international students could be showing as signs of mental health struggles, I think are really important. And as we know, figures of authority are going to be more influential. So training in combining, and also for the counselors themselves, having more training in combining Eastern and Western counseling models. So putting in that meditation, working on mindfulness, as well as perhaps accompanied by medication or group therapy. So that was the gist of my capstone. I know that was really long, but if there are any questions, I'd love to answer any in about the 10 minutes we have left.
You know, Veronica, hearing your study and hearing about your new job title, I'd love to know whether there was any influence because of your research on adding international education to your job title and where you see that going at OSPI.
For the link to Washington and to OSPI, really I felt that while international ed had kind of previously been housed in the social studies, I thought that as world languages, my job is to integrate different cultures, and our social studies curriculum tends to be much more focused on domestic things here in the United States. And so there's no shade, but I thought that I was a little bit more equipped to handle it. And that's why I have a very big passion, having been an international student myself and wanting to someday be an international teacher or work abroad. I also want to figure out a way that we can make it better here for teachers that are coming over, just because I've had that experience. And really dealing with a lot of different cultures, different perspectives, different experiences, I think is more in the realm of world languages. So, and I've tried to really help, and whether it's working with this Embassy of Spain and their education and how they're supporting teachers, or even reaching out and learning. I had a whole meeting with our chief counsel about J1 visas and learning about the federal programs and how all of that works. And hopefully that we can then support more teachers and encourage districts that are seeking international teachers or cross-cultural experiences. They can come to me for help and I can give them aid.
I have a question, Veronica. It was interesting to me. It's a very interesting study you did first. I wasn't sure what I was going to learn here, and I learned a lot. Is it fair to presume that most, if not all, students that come over here as international students or go elsewhere to other countries to study, are they already fairly big risk takers and independent by nature? And if so, would this predisposition by nature or personality help them overcome challenges facing them as a guest student a little bit more readily? I mean, is that something to consider?
That absolutely is. I think that, maybe another question would be for our expectations about counseling. And so getting more of a demographic survey would be simply asking, reasons why they wanted to study here. It was funny because, I actually had 2 or 3 Canadian students respond because of how close this university was to the Canadian border. And so that's why they were like, well, English, language was never a barrier. But for some students, it might be, pressure from family, that they see job prospects over here are better. One of the students was really interesting, was from Thailand, and the Thai government actually pays for students to come over, supports all of their fees, but in return, they must go back and work for the Thai government for double the amount of time that they were over here. So, for them, it might have, they might be more risk takers. And for some, it might have been, they have an idea of what life in the United States is like, and they're interested. I really think that that's a question that I can't answer based on this survey, and really would be interesting to find out from the students themselves.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, we are known around the world for having some of the absolute best programs. It's why we have, you know, engineering programs, why we have, there's the reason I had so many respondents from India on this survey was a lot of them said they came over because of the auto industry and the opportunities that the that auto engineering provided for them, and being so close, so internships, things like that, that they didn't have back home. And they were a lot older, actually. They brought their families, which to me is an even bigger risk. So,
Wow.
you know, I really can't say, and that's really interesting because, you know, Angela, they might not fit in. They might not feel like their social identity fits with their home culture either. So that
Yeah,
could
you
be
don't know how it worked at home even, and what may have mostly motivated them to take such a leap.
Yeah.
You know, and I something else that I learned here, or something that I learned, was about the different approaches between Western and Eastern counseling, and that you mentioned that Western counseling had more to do with finding out what's wrong and fixing it in one way or another. And there's lots of different counseling approaches to that. But you know, that thinking about finding out what's wrong is kind of almost inherent in our English language as US Americans. When you see somebody doing something that's a little perceived as off the norm, you ask, what's wrong? Assuming that something is wrong. Something might not be wrong per se. It might be off kilter. It might be a new challenge. It could be any number of things. But quite often our go-to query is, what's wrong? Maybe it kind of exists in how language expresses orientation to what's not exactly in line with norm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me.
I find even in English across the pond, when my friends who are British, if they ask they would open up conversations, all right? And that always, at first was weird for me, but then even the same thing, it's asking, it's almost the assumption that something is wrong, even though that they are just coming in. So, I think that, and obviously these are very broad generalizations. I do have in my actual capstone paper, the literature and did find the studies. But there's, it's very interesting, especially here in the United States, that some things like mindfulness is now being used in a lot more classrooms, especially, starting in kindergarten and preschool, they're teaching students mindfulness because of how effective it has been. And I think it's going to be a very big perspective shift to not always think of what is wrong with me and just saying, this is something that I have and I live my life with it. I like to think of it as, acceptance or happiness is not a thing I achieve. It's something you do every day. And so focusing on mindfulness, focusing on meditation and centering, and so that kind of more of an Eastern approach is more in line with perhaps long-term, but I also don't want to discount the use of, sometimes there are physical things that can be wrong in the brain. And so being able to provide medication or look at it, for some people that might even look at it as, it makes more sense to them that way, and they're able to better treat it. So yeah, I really hope, I've tried to stay in contact with my partners, and I really hope that they continue doing this now that I've provided the framework for the study. I really hope and that they can present this and continue on and help more international students. Some universities are doing this and some don't. And so, it really depends.
I have a kind of a It's kind of a question. Well, that's a question. I'll call it a question. I'm curious about like the suburban and urban expectations of students that have come, and how that affects their experience. Like I've seen it in academics and even in sport, where people will come from abroad, they'll expect this like American city experience, and then they'll be like kind of just choked by the suburbs, and it, like, for lack of a better term, they're just like, this is not the connected, like really cosmopolitan experience that I was looking for. And so like that can contribute to feelings of isolation, depression. Even in sport, like Ricky Rubio, a Spanish basketball player, famously was like, I don't want to go to Minnesota to play basketball. Like, you can't, don't send me there. And so that's like, I'm just curious, like, have you come across that where people are like, I wasn't ready for American suburban life?
It really depends. Because again, my respondents tended to be older, so they already had families and were looking more for they wanted more of the suburban experience. Now, the university I worked with, it was very much in, they could walk around. I actually lived pretty much down the street before I moved here to Washington from this university, and we would see them walking all downtown, and it was great. It honestly might have contributed. There is a big difference between coming into LA or Seattle or New York or even Atlanta, and then, Jacksonville, Florida. So it also could be a weather or a temperature thing, depending on where you go. That can also be, if it's darker more times of the year. The student from Africa brought that up, that, the Midwest was very dark and very snowy compared to where she was coming from, closer to the equator. So, I mean, that could also, and that would be more of an expectation of, as opposed to counseling, more their expectations of the university as a whole. And I'm not sure how you would, I think that would just be on the international student to really research where they're applying before they go. And they do not have to stay. One of my students had spent time in Pennsylvania, and then it didn't work out. So he transferred to this university later on, and he was much happier. And it was a smaller university. He was at Penn State, 50,000. He felt lost. But being able to be at a smaller 20,000, but that was, included much smaller undergraduate population, was a lot better for him. And he was able to live on campus in apartments. So he was closer to a lot of his friends.
Yeah, part of that dynamic too is like having a car. I forgot. That's like kind of inherent in the question, but like dependency on cars or like walkability of certain areas is like it's probably a big factor there. Like you get to a place that you can't navigate other than on foot, and what's within reach, just like more neighborhood. If you're on a university campus, there's always going to be something. But anyway, thanks for answering that.
So I'm gonna.
Oh, I just have one more thing to observe. This is Michelle. It reminds me a lot of what you're talking about is really insightful in relation to things like our visiting teachers on J-1 visas. And one of the things that I think allowed us to manage that situation well in Seattle is that for all the Chinese teachers, we had a Chinese director of the Confucius Institute who kind of served as a big sister or mother hen, and would bring them in on the weekend, make food for them and things like that. So they had a little bit of, through their communal connections and through certainly the Chinese language teachers in our state as well, that helped, I think, maintain their mental health. And the Spanish teachers, they were usually a little more independent anyway, experienced traveling, but they also had our Spanish Center director at the University of Washington, who was always a conduit in some way. And so that's something else to just be aware of, is that if teachers are coming in like as onesies and don't have anybody else to connect with, that's a lot harder for them, I think, than when there's a group of them and there's someone who's looking out for them.
Well, and this segues well to my newsletter, which will be coming out on Tuesday, that I have put links for all the languages that I could find for the teaching, all the AATs and all those. I have CELTA on there, all of them, and finding, working together and creating those communities, helping our teachers to create a new social identity while they're here, perhaps for the long haul. But that's it. I'd like to thank you all for joining, and I am going to stop recording and